Welcome members to today's Transport Committee, the first committee of this municipal year. Before we get on to our guests, we've got some formal business we need to get back onto, and a lot of that is more than normal because it's our first meeting of the year. So, have we got any apologies to absence?
No apologies, Assembly Member Bailey is on his way.
Fantastic, thank you very much. We've got two areas we're discussing today. One is around the tube, and that will be looking at some of the recent delays and also the works going on this weekend when we've got the FA Cup and Royal Wedding. And the second part will be looking at river bus services. So we'll get onto that shortly. If you want to take part on social media, use #AssemblyTransport. And welcome, we've got lots of visitors in the gallery this morning. Can I just remind everyone and members as well, please put your phones onto silent. The last thing we want is people's phones and other gadgets going off throughout the meeting. Now, in terms of Chair's announcements, I do first of all want to put on record my thanks to Keith for being a fantastic Chair over the last year, really driven us through some of the transport strategy, some of that really detailed work and looking at some really innovative things like new technology in vehicles and so on. So thank you, Keith, for that and being a great chair over the last year. Look forward to you carrying on your contribution to the committee this year. And I also wanted to put on record our thanks to Val Shawcross, who is retiring as Deputy Mayor for Transport. Obviously, she was for 8 years co-chairing me on this committee, and then we've had a really good relationship with her over the last 2 years. So I will write on behalf of the committee thanking her for her work, and we should welcome Heidi Alexander and look forward to getting a private meeting with her soon to try and get to start to develop a relationship with her. Declaration of interest. Are there any other declarations people want to raise, and can we note the list in the report? Noted. Lovely, thank you very much. Membership of the committee. Can we note the membership and chairing arrangements of the committee as set out in the supplementary agenda, and welcome Florence as Deputy Chair over the coming year. Is that noted? Can we note our committee's terms of reference?
Agreed.
Thank you. And can we note the committee's standing delegations? Fantastic, thank you very much. And can we note the minutes from the 19th of February and 1st of March meetings to be signed? Thank you very much. And can we note our summary list of actions? Wonderful. Now we can get on to our first hearing of the day. So thank you very much. Welcome our guests. We've got Peter McNaught, who's Director of Asset Operations at Transport for London. Welcome. And Nigel Holness, Director of Network Operations at Transport for London. Thank you both very much for coming along today. We wanted to catch up on issues around the tube, in particular some of the delays we've seen recently. So my first question to you is the network resilient?
I'll start with that, Chair. Thank you. I would say yes, but is it as resilient as we want it to be? No. And the reason I say that, myself and Nigel work daily, weekly, monthly, continuously trying to drive improvement in the performance of the underground. It's in our DNA, if you like. It disappoints us and frustrates us that performance of signalling, for example, last year, we saw a 3% increase in the number of service-affecting signal failures between last year and the year before. However, over 4 years, if you look back as far as 4 years, we're still 24% better than we were. So it's a bump in the road. We're on the case. I've recently put together my dedicated team on asset operations, and I have a dedicated team on signals. So I have a head of signals across the whole of London Underground that is
Peter,
absolutely focused.
Can we have the volume up a little bit? Just a little bit.
Speak maybe slightly more into the microphone, Peter.
In the background, which is...
Yeah,
so you should talk about the 4 years, sorry.
So if you look further back as 4 years, we've seen a 24% improvement in the number of signal failures. But last year we saw a 3% blip. And as I say, it is a blip. It's unfortunate for our customers on the district and the Metropolitan line in particular. That's where we've seen some of the degradation. So of the lines we have, 5 of the lines have actually improved in performance, and 5 of them have seen a slight reduction. But the main ones that have seen an increase in service affecting failures are the Met and the district. it isn't really a surprise. The Metropolitan and the District are part of the subsurface lines. They're some of our oldest signalling equipment. And we do have major investment project in 4LM to improve that performance considerably and replace with modern signalling technology. But my team aren't sitting around waiting for 4LM to come and rescue us. We have a detailed reliability improvement plan for the subsurface line signalling to make sure that the performance gets back to where it was and possibly even better in advance of 4LM being introduced.
What's your message to passengers then who have suffered serious delays? We'll get into some of the examples, but you know, the Jubilee line the other week and so on. What's your message to the millions of passengers who are really suffering delays on the tube?
Our message is we apologise for those delays. We don't want them to happen. Sometimes there is pain as a result of the investment we are putting in the railway. And the story behind the Jubilee line in particular is an investment programme that we are putting in place to replace emergency power supplies across the network. So I don't know if you remember, but maybe midway through last year, we had a particularly nasty failure on the south end of the Northern line where customers were badly disrupted on a Friday evening. And that was caused by an emergency power supply that it had failed in a redundant way, so you didn't know it wasn't working until actually it was called on to be used. As a result of that failure, we took ownership of all emergency power supplies across London Underground, and we put a project in place to make sure they were all working and replace any obsolete ones. Unfortunately, at Neasden, during that process, an electrician disconnected a neutral wire which put a voltage spike through the equipment and caused the failure we suffered. But we have been replacing several of these power supplies up until then.
I think if I could add, I think it just illustrates the importance of the work that actually we've been doing over many years to upgrade the tube actually, and Peter talked briefly about the 4 Lines modernisation programme, and that's an example of a project which is trying to address the oldest parts of the network. So committee members may know that, for example, we have a signalling frame at Edgware Road which dates back to 1926, and that will be coming out of service soon, thankfully. Only 2 weeks ago, in fact, we opened the new service control centre at Hammersmith, and this summer we will commission the first automatic train operation on the subsurface lines, actually from Hammersmith to Latimer Road, and then over the next couple of years we'll gradually switch over to the new ATO signalling system, and that will help improve capacity, and actually we'll hope to see levels of performance that actually we see on the Northern line today. The Jubilee line, notwithstanding that difficult issue a few weeks ago, I fully appreciate and understand that. But if you look at the lines that we've upgraded, an example is the Victoria line. You know, in the Victoria line now we've got 36 trains an hour in the peaks. So we're really looking through this 4 Lines modernisation project and the investment in the tube to continue to grow the capacity, to run more trains per hour, to move more people, more reliability. And I think it just really illustrates the importance of continuing to invest in the tube, which means that us as an organisation, we have to be as efficient as we possibly can be, driving out savings, looking at innovative ways of doing maintenance so that we continue to drive the long-term performance of the tube in the right direction.
Okay, let's move to another member. Keith.
Thank you. We've seen many severe delays on the District, Piccadilly and Circle lines this year, many over 15 minutes. Looking at the briefing that we had, a lot of that is attributed to staffing issues. What kind of staffing issues have caused it? Is that the main cause of the 15-minute plus delays, the staffing issues?
I think it's fair to say there's a quite a wide range of issues on those lines. So it would range from things like the age of the fleet. So if you look at the Piccadilly line trains, for example, they date back to 1973. They're not quite the oldest train that we've got on the tube, but they take a lot of amazing work from Peter's team to keep the system running. So we've had some fleet issues, we've had some customer issues. We will also always in there have a mix of staffing issues, so whether that's availability or whether that's errors. I mean, generally our staff do a great job, I have to say that, but occasionally they get it wrong as well. So it's a mix of things that have caused problems on those lines.
So in relation to the staffing issues, is it that you don't have enough staff, or is it that they no longer perform as well as they did? I mean, historically that hasn't always been a problem, so why is it a problem now?
I think we're trying to be as efficient as possible. I would say that on the side of resourcing, the Piccadilly line again is a case in point. It's what we call a feeder line to the London Underground, so it gets a huge amount of turnover. New drivers coming in, new drivers then staying with the line for a period of time and moving on. And we have to make sure that we get the pipeline of recruitment right. And I would say that going back a year or two, perhaps one or two decisions were made about the level of resourcing, which reflected itself in a number of availability related delays through the summer. What I would say that we're in the best position now that we've been in for 2 years on availability and staff related errors. So I like to think that we've come out of that. But that's, that particularly affected the Piccadilly line and one or two other lines. I think the more general point about the District line and Circle line, I think, again, both Peter and I would accept and actually apologise for the performance of those lines in the last few months. I mean, it is a blip, but they are the oldest parts of the network. They're undergoing surgery, actually, as we do 4LM, which is, the future is bright, but it's, the journey onto that destination can be quite painful at times.
Wasn't the investment in the Piccadilly line put back a little while ago? Wasn't there some delay or deferral in the upgrading, I seem to recall? Is that right?
It has moved around. The Piccadilly line upgrade as part of the deep tube has moved around in recent years, but we're hoping now that we're very close to being able to confirm some more investment on the Piccadilly line in particular. We do need to see a new train there. It is an old mechanical type train. I think, as I said, Peter's team do a great job keeping it going, but what we really need to get to is similar to we've got on the subsurface lines. We've walked through air-conditioned tubes, and that's really the goal for the deep tube programme.
So it certainly is worth mentioning as well with regard to the signalling system on the Piccadilly line. My team and our research and project team over last year replaced the old programme machines to greatly improve the reliability. So if you look back probably September, October time, the Piccadilly line was suffering just as badly as the District line. But that performance has considerably improved because we finished that project and we're not seeing those signalling errors that we were experiencing just to the sheer age of the old programming machines.
So when are we likely to see the improvements on the District line?
District line, I've got a list of things to probably help you if I take through what my team are doing to try to bring up the District line while we wait for 4LM to come. So if you imagine that there's probably a few main areas that cause signal failures or are reported, or the symptom is a signal failure. One is points, so the point mechanisms. So we are doing around the subsurface lines, we're replacing 2,300 point indication pins on our 4-foot point mechanisms, which is the most common failure mode on those point mechanisms, and that will be done by September. We also have a mitigation programme for 249 of the Shorelock point mechanisms, which is actually a new modern point mechanism we fitted, which has many benefits, but actually it's got a couple of reliability flaws with it. So we're going back around those 249 sets of points to make sure that those problems are eliminated. And we've already eliminated all of those problems on every line apart from the District line, and we are working through the District line now to bring that to a close on the District line as well. We've also introduced 3 dedicated complete point care teams on the subsurface lines, because it's points is where track and signals come together. So what you can get are the signalling teams attending a set of points, setting it up perfectly and walking away saying it all works fine. But if the points are sitting on uneven track, as soon as the train goes over it, you get all sorts of problems. So these dedicated complete point care teams attend a set of points, set it up, make sure the track form underneath it is proper so that they walk away and that asset works properly. Now they're working round the SSL subsurface lines around 55 critical ends of points, and they're doing that over the summer period to make sure those points are working properly. If I move on then to train stops, so on the old subsystem signalling, where you've got a red light, you also have the protection system of a train stop that flicks up, so that if the train goes through the red light, it slams the emergency brakes on the train. Train stops also cause a number of failures on the railway. They're air operated and they leak air, which results in it not operating properly and manifesting itself as a red signal because the system fails safe. So we're going round and we're replacing 1,322 pneumatic motors across the subsurface lines. 947 of those are on the subsurface lines, and we're doing that over the next year. In addition to that, we've got targeted replacement of the contact boxes in the train stops, because that's a failure mode of the train stops. And then I think it's worth pointing out that of all the signal failures we have, 37% of them occur at start of traffic. So the railway goes to bed working and it wakes up not working. It's no coincidence that, every night we have between 4,000 and 7,000 human beings access our track every night to do maintenance, project work, and by no means all of those people are signalling experts. Some of them are doing civil inspections, some of them are installing new cable for the 4LM project, and what we have is those people inadvertently step on things, damage things, and then you go to switch the railway on in the morning and it doesn't work. So we've got a big focus to work through and improve start of traffic. And that starts with working with my colleagues in Nigel's organisation who run service control. So if you imagine the FAT controller running the railway network, in the middle of the night those people are still on duty. So what we've set up is a call at 4 o'clock in the morning where each of those service controllers on every network has the responsibility to check that every single signalling track circuit is operational. If any of them are down, every one of those 7,000 possible groups of people on the track have a connect radio, so we can get in touch with them to find out, is it something you're doing that is causing this failure, and will it be fixed in time for start of traffic? We're also looking to tidy up our network. There's been a lot of things done in the past by previous projects and renewals where scrap has not been removed from the railway. So we are taking the opportunity to tidy our railway at key intersecting junctions. We call them sort of critical assets. So we're removing scrap. If you take Acton Town, for example, we've already removed 260 tonnes of scrap from Acton Town area. And our plan is to make these critical asset areas that have been some of our most untidy areas, to make them our best shining example areas. I think the other thing is we're putting strict control in place for what we call critical jobs. Now, a critical job may be because of the complexity. So if people are ripping up the track and trying to put it back together in the 2.5 odd hours they have during engineering hours, that's a critical job. Equally, a critical job might be quite a simple job, but in a very high impact area, like Earls Court or Acton Town. So when we flag a critical job, there is all sorts of additional protection we're now putting in place that has to be with those people, technical officers from the signalling team, to make sure if anything goes wrong, we can fix it as quickly as possible to minimise disruption to our customers. I think the other thing is education. Education for all these people going onto the track about the damage they can cause, the things they need to look for. And on top of that, we're putting signage. So in these key critical asset areas, as you walk along the track and you come to one of those key areas, there will be signs on the track that tell you you're entering a key reliability area for London Underground. Take care, report any damage, don't leave things lying around. We're also looking to utilise the PA systems in the station. If you imagine we use them for our customers through the day to tell them about taking care, we're looking to start to use them to remind all the people coming on and off the railway, have you made sure that you've reported any damage? Please take care, you're entering a critical area, make sure that you leave the railway in a reliable place.
Lovely, thank you. So tightening up your processes sounds like it's going to work. And I've seen a couple of members who want to come in briefly before I move on to Sean. So I've got Tom and Joanne.
Yeah, just very quickly, looking at the staff levels, is it possible that any of the issues of staffing have anything to do with the TfL transformation programme, or is that something that wouldn't affect any of these issues under staffing?
I mean, I think, to Nigel's point, it's probably helpful to explain what a feeder line is. When train operators apply for a job with London Underground, they get allocated to a line, but because the Piccadilly line's a manually controlled train, and so is the District line, people tend to want to move away from manually controlled trains to get onto the automatic train because it's easier, it's less difficult for you, less chance of having a spat. So what we see is a migration of train operators from those lines to the automatic lines, and the new recruits end up coming into the Piccadilly and District. So in answer to your question, it's nothing to do with the transformation that we've had an issue with
specifically to do with train drivers and things, not to do with staffing, to do with engineering or anything.
Yeah. I mean, our frontline staff are not involved in the sort of transformation work that we're doing to make TfL more efficient.
Thank you. Joanne, you wanted to pick up?
Yeah, it nicely follows on from that, because my constituents rely on the Piccadilly line, thankfully recently at the northern end rather than the southern end. But could you just date us as to the procurement of your new trains? Is that still on track?
Still on track. It hasn't been announced yet, I don't think, and I'm excluded from knowing which supplier it is. They've all got code names, but it hasn't been announced yet. But I believe the announcement's going to be soon, this month, I think.
But it's still on track?
Still on track.
Thank you.
Very good. Lovely, thank you. Sean?
Morning, gentlemen. You made a comment earlier on about electrician reconnecting something wrong and that earthline, I think you said, and that putting stuff down. But is there anything particularly wrong with the power supply that's leading to so many failures? And how are you managing your relationship with UK Power Networks?
I mean, I can sort of have a go at that. I mean, I guess it's sort of predominantly Peter's area, but I think we've got pretty resilient supply. So, for example, the stations have got 3 levels of supply. So we have our own supplier, we have the street supplier, and we have a battery backup system. We have our own power control room. We do high voltage switching and low voltage switching. So we've got a pretty diverse power supply. And the problem comes is that there are still in 1 or 2 locations, I guess we have the risk of a single point failure, or the risk of somebody doing something wrong, which is effectively what's happened on the Jubilee line 2 or 3 weeks ago. Thankfully, it's a very rare occurrence, but when it does go wrong, obviously it was very difficult, very challenging for the organisation, of course, its customers as well. So really, we are thoroughly investigating that particular issue. There's a formal investigation being carried out right now. It will be completed by the end of the month, and that will identify some recommendations, probably around control of work, control of access, planning, better planning, these sorts of things, because they are they've been sort of indicated as the causes of that particular failure. But generally, our power supply is very strong, very resilient.
Okay. Peter, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I think Nigel's covered it. You know, I can think of examples, and actually part of the role of this emergency power supply I spoke about is if one power supply fails, this device switches across onto the second power supply. So we have dual power supply to all our stations, etc. And if we develop a problem, so sometimes I might get reports of lifts and escalators being not being as reliable as we want them to be because of ripple on the power supply. So I will work with UK Power Networks to understand where that's coming from, but while we're doing that, I'll switch the device across to run from our other supply while we put instrumentation on the supply to understand the cause.
Okay, thank you for that. Are some of the delays we're experiencing a consequence of the reduced maintenance spend? By some estimations, the maintenance spend has reduced by almost £6 million. Is that having any onward effect? It seems like quite a large sum.
I don't think so at all. You know, I'm obviously in charge of all of the asset areas, and it's me that's been working to reduce how we spend the money, what money we spend. And one of the areas that we insisted that our efficiency programme did not affect was safety or reliability. It's not allowed to affect that, so we haven't cut from the frontline maintenance. We've saved a lot of money in some of our external contracts, and we've brought work in-house. We've looked at how we can do things more efficiently, but we haven't reduced the actual maintenance that we do, if that makes sense.
So you're very confident that your current programme of cost saving has actually generated that saving rather than it being dissipated from your budget and that causing you any difficulties?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
We thank you very much. And then Navin this weekend.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Match and event days at Wembley Stadium, as we all know, are always very challenging and complex in sort of normal days. This Saturday we have both FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium with a London club involved, as well as we have the Royal Wedding with street parties, and it's going to be really, really buzzing that area. Do you think it is wise to have, and should you not have suspended planned engineering works over this weekend? Because that is going to contribute a huge problem, both operationally as well as to the communities and neighborhoods and people going to stadium, as well as other much more flow of traffic.
So the decision on when we hold planned closures for essential engineering works, it's never an easy one. This weekend, we've been talking about District 9 performance and reliability, and actually this weekend sees a closure predominantly on the District and Circle line, which is doing some really essential work for us around Earls Court, Gloucester Road, Fulham Broadway, Putney, West Kensington. There is a significant amount of work that's going on this weekend. Thankfully, the vast majority of TfL services are running, and certainly if you look at some of the specific locations, so Wembley will be fully served by the Metropolitan line, it will be fully served by the Jubilee line, and of course the Bakerloo line will also be serving Wembley Central. There are obviously the Metropolitan and Jubilee lines will be running a full service up there, and we'll do our usual match day work there. If we look at the Royal Wedding, clearly it's in Windsor. These closures were planned, they're planning for these is about a year to 2 years in advance. A lot of planning goes into these, and of course we're very, very conscious of the impact on communities, customers, and the need to keep London moving, really. We've worked very closely with Network Rail and the train operators to make sure people can get to and from Windsor. Again, Paddington will be served by the Circle and Hammersmith line, and Waterloo will be served by the Northern line, the Bakerloo line, and the Jubilee line, so people will be able to come and go from Windsor. It is not easy to find a place where you can do this work in what is a massively packed calendar of events for London. We need to avoid football matches, we need to avoid, in this particular area, things like Wimbledon are coming up, Queen's Club tennis is coming up, Polo in the Park is coming up, lots of events in Hyde Park, and of course we have to fit in other closures, so for example the Four Lines modernisation. So really this is all about ensuring that we continue to have a safe and reliable railway, and having reviewed this after the date of the Royal Wedding was announced, we're still confident that it is okay for us to have this closure and get this important work done. As I say, the vast majority of TfL services will be running. We will have additional staff out at the key locations supporting people that are travelling in and around London.
This is going to be an exceptional day, albeit one day, but given the large number of passengers over on Saturday and generally the weekend, and are you confident that you are going to be able to deal with the increased passengers on the network?
I am confident actually, and we did look back at the last royal wedding at Windsor with Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, and we've looked at the gate line data that we collected on people, and so we factored that into the decision, and there was no discernible impact on people around that time travelling to and from Windsor, and we've got those services running again with our National Rail colleagues. So we are working closely with them to make sure people can get to and from Windsor and can get to and from the Underground. As I say, it's a very difficult judgment, a very difficult balance. We do need to get this work done. It is essential. It is about the underlying reliability of the tube, things that we've just been talking about. And it is difficult to balance it and find a space in a busy calendar. If you look forward at the closures through the summer, almost every weekend we've got vital works going on, and it is really very difficult in a very busy calendar to find the right place to do this work.
Are you able to give absolute assurance to my residents in Brent living in and around Wembley area that you have taken adequate measures toward any disruption? Because this is going to be, I mean, just a major day, and that there will not be any chaos or the disruption that they would be facing.
I mean, absolutely, I understand the point you're making. We're very, very experienced at handling events at Wembley and other locations, and we're very confident in our plans to get people to and from the football very safely on Saturday.
Is there a number which people can dial if they have issues arising from...
Yeah, well, people can contact the TfL Customer Contact Centre. It's advertised very widely on the tube. I can't quite remember what the number is myself, but people can do that. Of course, they can write to us, they can email us, they can call us if they have any concerns. But of course, all of our stations are all staffed as well, so I encourage people to ask any member of station staff if they've got any concerns. But we're running full services on those lines that are serving Wembley at the weekend, as well as Paddington and Waterloo. Excuse me.
I'm still concerned about the planned engineering works. I mean, what would be the consequence of actually halting that work, certainly for Saturday? Is it not doable? Will it disrupt and destroy your complete management plan, whatever operational arrangements you made?
At this point, and it isn't the primary consideration, but it is an important consideration, the cost of abortive works would be significant. But far more importantly, we're doing work on track renewal. And I've got the detail here, but it's points and crossings work. It's track renewal at Earls Court, track renewal at Goslar Road, work around Parsons Green, West Brompton, Wimbledon, East Putney. So there are millions and millions of pounds being spent on the reliability of the district line to ensure that it's better for customers. So again, having evaluated this and re-evaluated it after the date of the royal wedding was announced, we're confident that it's really balancing all these factors together is the best time to do the work. We're confident that people can get to the football, and we're confident that people can use Paddington and Waterloo to get out and back to Wimbledon.
It's worth pointing out in support of Nigel.
Wedding, sorry.
So it will be no more than what you generally find conditions when you have a match or major events at Wembley Stadium. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, we have had closures before that have coincided with matches at Wembley Stadium, and even this season...
No, but here we're talking about royal wedding as well.
Yes, yeah. So taking the match first of all, I mean, obviously Tottenham Hotspur have been playing at Wembley all season, sold out virtually every game. So we're very, very well practiced at managing that. And of course, we've managed that in and around closures of the Underground as well, where we've had to get essential maintenance work. I can only really go back to my last point, which we looked at the data for the last royal wedding in Windsor. We've looked at the planned closures. We've looked at the services that we've got supporting Waterloo and Paddington to get to and from Windsor. And we've worked closely with Network Rail on their closure programme and the TOC, so South Western Railways, South Eastern, Great Western, to ensure that we have a really joined up approach and get people to and from the royal wedding.
With respect, I've got quite a lot of members wanting to come in, but I think the scale of this wedding is rather different to Prince Charles's wedding in Windsor, and I think it's more akin to Catherine and William's. And it's not just about people getting to Windsor, it's people going to events in London, it's going to see family and using the wedding as an occasion to get together and celebrate. It's about Londoners getting around to see their family and friends and go to events, not just people wanting to go to Windsor. And same with the FA Cup, people use that quite. I just wanted to pick up, before I bring in other members, what additional staff are you putting on at key stations such as Waterloo, such as Clapham Junction and the like, where people will be using the overground, the underground to then go out to perhaps Windsor and places? And what links do you have with Network Rail? Because too often, and I raise this a lot through Mayor's questions, you have closures at the same time as Network Rail, partly West London, huge chunks out, going out, trying to get to Ealing from Central London, impossible, because both of you are doing works at the same time.
So we have worked very closely with Network Rail on this weekend's services, and in particular the train operators. We've been working at managing director level to ensure that we have a seamless approach. We've looked at the key pinch points, and I won't go over them again, and we've checked to ensure that we're adequately staffed. So on TfL we will supplement our existing staff at Waterloo and at Paddington, for example, both with our regular operational staff, but also with our TfL ambassadors. So these are voluntary staff that will go out and help support customers as well. So we're confident that the staffing levels will be adequate.
That's great. Now, on this particular point, before I bring Florence in on a different one, Keith and Caroline Hussey wants to come in. Yeah. Covered?
Almost completely covered, but I just want to know what the evidence you have that this royal wedding will be the same levels of people wanting to move around as the one of Prince Charles a few years ago, because this seems to be such a much bigger scale.
I mean, the main data that we've used is gate line data, so people tapping in and tapping out to look at people moving across London and moving.
But that's making the assumption this wedding is the same size in terms of people wanting to move. Have you modelled a scenario where many more people are travelling?
I can't explicitly say that here. I think what we will do is we'll provide some evidence to you outside the meeting of the approach that we've taken to assess the impact of this royal wedding on central London.
Okay, thank you. Because she's an international film star, TV star, isn't she? So it just adds another level of interest in people. Right, a separate issue before we close.
Separate issue, but it is sort of linked to delays and work. So you'll be aware that the Kennington branch, the bank branch of the Northern Line at Kennington, will be closed for a period of 16 weeks. Chair, I should declare an interest because that's the station that I use to commute here every morning. So obviously I would want that work to be speedily completed. And I have been discussing this with other colleagues in TfL, but I think just going back to the first question from the Chair to you, Peter, in terms of the additional stations that we are going to be asking commuters to use, mainly Elephant Castle Oval and Waterloo, which, as we know, are already bursting at the seams at peak times. And the closure is going to start on the 26th of May, which is a Saturday, and then we fall into that bank half-term weekend. The real test is going to be on Monday, the 4th of June, when everyone's going back to work and school. Is the network going to be resilient for that closure?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've obviously, in addition to Nigel, first of all, taking the weekend just coming, we are putting additional technical officers on duty. So our insurance policy people who are spread across the network in event of any failure. And equally on the 4th, we will have additional resource available to attend and deal with any failure if one occurs. I think on the Network Rail point, it's also worth mentioning that in our LUCC at Palestra, we have a permanent member of Network Rail now in there, so that link is absolute and real time with anything with Network Rail. So if they have a problem, we know about it, we can deal with it, we can work across our stations to help move the flow of customers and deal with it.
Can I pick up the bank particular issue? I mean, the work at Bank is part of the Northern Line Kennington is part of the Northern Line extension, and we have to create some new passageways there. And we have extensively looked at the different options of doing the work, from engineering work for weekend closures. We looked at the cost options. We've looked at the safety issues. Actually, can we keep those platforms open. We were down there on a site visit only the other week actually, and our conclusion is that this is the best way, this is the optimum way to get the work done. Now, I do accept that there's significant disruption, but this is all about improving the overall performance of the Northern Line, supporting the Northern Line extension. So again, the destination's worth a journey, but it will be challenging for people. We're putting a huge amount of effort into what we call travel demand management, publicity, so people will see the sort of yellow flash stickers around the underground, hear announcements. There'll be additional staff, and we will be absolutely monitoring it very, very closely to make sure that it is safe. But we have to get the work done. So I would apologise for the disruption that is going to cause yourself and other customers that use Kennington. It's never easy on a system that's very old and is very, very busy. But we will do our very best to get the work done as quickly as possible, and we will be monitoring it very, very closely.
That's good. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter and Nigel, for your openness this morning and answers to our questions. I think if there's anything further, we will write to you to perhaps get some of that real detail on the lines that you set out, Peter, so we've got that on record. So thank you very much for your time. You're now free to leave. And members, can we note the report and the discussion we've just had? Thank you very much. Now, whilst we're swapping over panels of guests, I'm going to whiz through some of the other business members, if that's okay. So let's move to item 10, motorcycle safety report. Can we note the committee's report as agreed under delegated authority by the former chairman? Agreed, lovely, and we'll follow that up in the year to find out what's happening on that. Cycling infrastructure report, item 11, can we note the committee's report as agreed under delegated authority by the former chairman and the record of the site visits? Agreed, lovely, thank you. Response to reports on bus services, item 12, can we note the response from TfL? Lovely, thank you. Item 13, response report on Outer London junctions. Can we note the response from TfL and the impact review for the report? Lovely, and we'll be looking at some further meetings and site visits to follow that up to feed into our work later in the year. Item 14, the Transport Committee work programme. Can we agree the work programme for 18-19, and can we also agree to delegate authority to me in consultation with party group lead members to agree the topic in terms of reference for our investigation into London's national rail network, a response to TfL's consultation on private hire safety regulation, and details of our site visit to the construction site for Tottenham Court Road, Elizabeth Line Station. Is that agreed?
Noted.
Lovely. And, right, so that's got us through that business. Let's welcome our guests. Are they coming down, please? Anybody come on down? I feel like saying the price is right, but I don't know if that's just showing my age. With everyone there. Tom won't know what we're talking about. The price is right.
I'm aware of that, Karen.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Vintage television.
Wonderful. Welcome our guests. And members, could I just remind you when the meeting's in hand, if you are speaking, members, when people ask in hearing, can people press and turn off the microphones if they're muttering to each other? The acoustics are very peculiar in here today.
I think the mics are turned up really loud.
The mics are loud, there's buzzing, we're being blinded by these lights. It's a strange chamber today, so if we could just be mindful of that, that would be great. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome our second panel of guests today, which is looking at the river and river services, particularly thinking about passengers using the river. So if I can just welcome our guests today, and I'm going to start this side. We've got Emma McFarlane, who's a passenger representative, works closely with Thames Clippers. Sean Collins, been before the committee before, Managing Director of MBNA Thames Clippers, welcome. Danny Price, who's the General Manager of Sponsored Services at TfL, so you look after all the river services and piers.
That includes river services, yes.
Fantastic. And Robin Mortimer, Chief Executive of the Port of London Authority, welcome. Thank you for coming today. So we're slightly behind our questions on the tube and issues with the royal wedding and the like this weekend, slightly overran. But if I could start off our questions, and we have done some work previously on the river, and I know many of us are interested in it. So a question to you, how will you, and how can we increase the number of commuter or sort of regular passenger journeys on the Thames? Who would like to start? I'm going to go to Thames Clippers first, because you provide the service. You know, how can that be done?
One of the key, we always manage to fill boats in commuter period, unsurprisingly. We are very different to any other form of transport in that we are limited in the amount of passengers that we can physically carry. Every passenger, by regulation, has got to have a seat. So the physical capacity is limited. That said, you can add as many boats within reason to the service, and that is regulated by the Port of London Authority and London River Services. But at the moment, one of the biggest problems we've got is congestion in the central section, so arguably between Tower Bridge and Westminster, and that congestion is predominantly around piers. So more pier space in central London is vitally needed before we can consider further expansion of services to the east and the west to bring those commuters in. And obviously there are significant demands at certain times on the service from a leisure and tourism perspective. We operate 25 kilometres, 22 piers, and many of those piers have got an amazing cultural connection along the river. So there is good demand in that sector as well.
Just go back to what you were saying. So congestion in the central section, is that just at peak times? Because surely some of the other river services, which we're not particularly focusing on, but the tourist boats, wouldn't be operating at peak times. So what's the issue with the pier capacity?
No, you take Embankment Pier, for instance.
Yes.
We have 3 services combined there in the AM and PM, or 3 in the morning, 2 in the evening. And that's because in the evening we've purposely tried to combine 2 services to limit the amount of boats we have going in and out of the pier. And we literally haven't even got enough space between our own service, not alone the leisure and tourism services that have to run from that pier
Just
as well.
literally the physical space at the piers,
Correct.
Not that you've got tourist boats alongside yours.
No.
Could I just add to that?
Yes.
Is that, thanks, Sean. We carried out a study in 2015 before we published our Thames Vision, where we said we think there's capacity to double the number of passenger journeys by 2035, and that study looked at the capacity constraints, if you like, how full the river is, and essentially the answer was there's a lot of spare capacity in the river, except at peak times at peak points. So, as Sean said, typically around Westminster and here outside, out in the Pool of London, outside Tower, is the real pinch points. And even then, it's the summer afternoon when we really sort of face those constraints. But the rest of the time, and certainly outside those areas, there's enormous capacity for growth. So that's the sort of the if you like, the evidence base that we've got to work on. And as Sean said, I think the key issue then is particularly in those hotspots, developing the piers to enable better utilisation of the limited space.
I'd just also like to add that 5 years ago, when we were awarded the contract from Transport for London to run RB6, very shortly after that, so 4 years ago, we worked with Transport for London, and they put a lot of resource into demand modelling for the future. And there's a lot of information there that demonstrates that we forecast by 2023 our operation alone could be carrying 7 million passengers. Last year we carried 4.1. That was a growth year on year again, but new services had been added in that period, namely Battersea Power Station service and expansion. We added more fleet, new boats to RB6. RB6 alone has seen 36% annual growth since its commencement, and the entire service, on average, since it started 19 years ago, has seen 40% growth.
You see real potential, and that if we could improve some of the pier capacity, that you, I mean, I think you're quoted Thames Clippers as saying that this is the potential to be the equivalent of the Hammersmith and City line on the river. So you absolutely believe that. And Robin, the PLA, you support that. You think
absolutely.
There's huge potential. But then I come to TfL, and TfL in 2012 likened the river to a medium-sized suburban bus route, which doesn't seem the same scale and ambitions. Is that right, Daniel? Or is it now you've got some passion and energy behind it?
I think there's always been passion and energy behind it. I think we should recognise 10 years ago the total river volume was half what it is today. So there has been significant progress made in growing river passenger volume. And with the challenge of doubling that again in 2035, there are key challenges. But again, it has shown that progress has been made. There's been a lot of investment in the pier infrastructure. I do think we should also look at how the capacity of those piers. So within the London pier strategy, which TfL, GLA and boat operators as well as waterfront boroughs are working on, we recognise not just increasing opportunities to increase the size of piers, but also looking at timetables, looking at the efficiencies, maybe having a more dynamic approach. Now, at the moment, these are, within the strategy, which is in draft form, are challenges, and we need to put actions against them. But I do think we need to not just look at the amount of infrastructure to increase, about how efficient that is. And part of that is actually looking at the operators and how they operate from each of the piers, time taken for boarding and lighting. And the other thing I want to add, I think the growth target to double for 2035, it's about safe and sustainable growth. And that safe has to come first. So I think everyone involved in the passenger working group are very passionate about that. So one thing absolutely everyone agrees on. We've got to do this safely. And therefore, I think in terms of increasing piers, we've got to look at a number of other factors, including increased number of freight on the river and other challenges as well. So we are equally very passionate, but we'll do it safely.
And who leads on river? Is it you personally, Danny, or is it... what team have you got? Because in the past, my memory is it was kind of people from the bus team who were nearing retirement went and did a year or so doing river services before they retired. Have you got someone who is passionate about expanding river services?
We have, and I'm hopefully not too... I've actually got a little bit of time to go before retirement. We do have a team in London River Services, and actually it's the collaboration, I think, with the PLA, with the boat operators that make the river successful, and it has that whole 10-year of driving success. So why wouldn't it continue going that way? We have challenges, but we need to overcome them.
Emma, from a passenger point of view, tell us what passengers
just
want.
A quick
is there
point.
demand?
So first of all, I'd like to say that I don't just represent myself today. I tend to speak to all of the passengers that I can come in contact with on my jetty and on boats generally. And actually, I've been trying to work with Thames Clippers to improve things that we've been giving them feedback. And also, I've been writing to the PLA. And that's one point I wanted to make this morning about the speed of the boats. So you can, add lots of boats, but sometimes the speed that they go along the Thames has dropped drastically, so that what you have, is bicycles running along the embankment quicker than the boats. So that's very frustrating as passengers, and we understand why that is, because you get feedback from houseboats that there's some kind of swell coming from the clippers. But I think that perhaps we ought to take a look at that and see whether we can speed up the service, because then of course you wouldn't necessarily need a huge amount of extra boats if you were turning around the system quicker.
Yeah. But you talk to passengers and people contact you. Is there a demand from people, particularly near the river and these new boats, that they want
Absolutely.
more
Anybody
services?
who lives near the river and has access to a jetty would take it any time over train or tube.
Okay, thank you. Now, TfL, what targets have you got, maybe including some interim targets, to increase the number of river bus journeys?
So currently the strategy aims to double, which again is quite a long way off. Within the pier strategy we've discussed it recently, and the reason I'm talking about very recent is we haven't long put most of this draft strategy together, so there's a lot of discussions within the passenger working groups on how we set targets. Because sometimes if you set an interim target of every single year, all of a sudden you if you can't achieve it in year one, it drives the wrong, perhaps, behaviours. But I think what we've discussed is actually looking with the boat operators, looking at their business targets and the rationale behind their targets and how that supports the delivery of over time, doubling river growth. We did have a target to hit 12 million passenger journeys by 2020. I think we are slightly behind that, looking at last year's numbers, but I do think there's a lot of good things that are happening last year with investment in Battersea Pier, with new boats from the likes of Thames Clippers that have invested in heavily, with a 4-year benefit of Westminster Pier that was extended the previous year. And what has been successful is developer-led peer infrastructure that has, including Battersea, that has happened over the last few years, and we'll continue to support that to happen.
Very keen as a committee to see in the transport strategy your overall targets to then have interim, and I know a number are going to be in the business plan that comes out at the end of this calendar year. Can we expect there to be an interim target in the business plan for river bus journeys?
If I can politely ask to take that back.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. We can pick that up afterwards. I think we would feel that you need to have something to be aiming for. You can't just have something in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We need something so you've got something to be focusing your energies around. Now,
as an operator, we would very much support that. We need to know where we're going on an annual basis. We can't just develop people and skills and conjure up boats overnight.
So
we've got to plan, and there's got to be a little bit more strategy in that regard.
Okay. And could I come to you, Robin, in terms of, we've talked about, and Danny's mentioned the safety on the river, and that's really important, but how can you manage these competing demands? We want more people using it as passengers, not just the tourists, as houseboats, leisure, freight. How do you manage that, the environment? Can you just give us an outline how you manage that, and if you want to increase the use of the river, how you're going to manage those demands?
Yeah, sure. So PLA is the safety regulator for the river, and obviously the other main body on the safety side is the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, which actually licenses the vessel, so we don't do the passenger vessel licensing. Overall, the safety record in the last 4 years has improved. So last year there was around a 20% reduction in what's called serious and very serious incidents, which is the MCA category. So we obviously want to see that sustained, and actually so far in 2018 the record is in line with that. So obviously our objective is to get to zero. That's the only goal you can have on safety, isn't it? Is to have absolutely zero incidents. So that's very much where we're driving, and the key part of that really is the causes of incidents when we investigate. Obviously every incident is investigated. The causes are the 3 main causes: human error, compliance failure, and mechanical error. And those are the things we work on. And obviously we work very closely with all the operators. Last year we ran a campaign around called Human Factors. So behaviour change, near miss reporting, all of those things which support safe operations. So those are the sorts of things we do. I would just come back to this point about the capacity issues, because obviously if you've got a system, which is what the river is, and you put extra demand on that system, then there's always greater risk associated with that, and that's why we think the dealing with these pinch points in central London is critical, not just from a growth and economic perspective, but from a safety perspective. And I would say, and I think going back to your earlier question, I think the LRS team is very passionate, very committed, very capable. I think it is fair to say, though, that TfL's budget is more constrained than it previously was, and the capital budgets are not necessarily there for the investments which were previously planned. So we think we need to look quite creatively at the sort of financing of some of these pier expansions, because if the public purse is not going to be able to provide all of that, how else are they going to be funded? So if we take embankment pier as an example, so TfL I know did a project, I think a couple of years ago now, looking at the costs of extending that pier, and budget for that would be between 1 and 4 million, depending on how you do it. We'd obviously love for TfL to be able to finance that. If that's not possible, then who does finance that is the question we're currently all faced with, I think.
Okay. Do you have set out somewhere details of these pinch points that you think need addressing to then help capacity? Would you be able to supply us with that?
Yeah, absolutely. We published a report actually
So
before the Thames Vision, which we can certainly send the committee. It was a Marico, which is a consultancy, and it modelled both current river use and future river use, and obviously takes account not just of the river bus service, but other passenger operators, the charter and tourism operators, freight, and obviously on the freight side, with the Thames Tideway project now ramping up, we're going to see more barge movements, more nighttime barge movements. So obviously all that we need to take into account.
Okay, yes.
Can I also add, just from the safety point of view, from TfL's perspective, we operate and own 8 of the busiest piers in London. And we have licences with operators. So we do recognise we have a significant influence on safety. And certainly we're in the pier strategy, working very closely with PLA. We're looking to sort of tighten that up to see how we can improve that even further. Maybe even looking at what goes into those licences and compliance with them. That's been, perhaps will be a little bit more intrusive, some might say, of what our own safety standards should be, and ensure that they're applied by operators in the future. And again, as I said beforehand, within the working group forums that we've had, the passion about ensuring that we have a safe river comes out really, really strongly. So it isn't just from a PLA's policing perspective, it comes from the boat operators, and TfL have a key role to play in that as well.
Can you just comment on the point Robin made about the funding situation at TfL and perhaps the reduction in capital investment that you planned in piers?
So over the course of the business plan, we'll be investing up to £1 million each year on renewals of piers infrastructure, as well as between £250,000 and £500,000 on pier maintenance. So absolutely the safe and well-being of the current piers is really important. We've just finished a life extension work on Greenwich Pier of 1.3 million. So there is money in there, but I do appreciate the point taken, particularly on Embankment Pier, which Robin and I and Sean as well have discussed in some detail about opportunities. And TfL currently are procuring some work around Embankment Pier to find out what the options are to extend.
Great, thank you. Sean, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd just like to go back to the capacity point again. And, we are suffering a bit on the Thames of going through an era where it just completely died. There was very, very little traffic on it at all. So, 25 years ago. And in the last 20 years, it has significantly grown, pleasingly. And it's growing more, as Robin has said, from a freight perspective. And so there does need to be some more thinking, some more planning and strategy as to how this can all work together. Because one of the things that we often get asked is, why the river can't be used more? When I'm walking to work or cycling to work or walking over a bridge, the river's empty. And there's a lot of commuters that is the perception of, that the river gives that perception. And we know that there are peaks and troughs in that. And we've got to sort of start thinking as to how we can accommodate the future. And it's very pleasing to hear that the PLA are pushing as much freight through the night. And when you look at the railways and how busy they are, and relatively small tracks, how many tracks could you get out there on low tide? Because equally we've got to remember that the river expands and contracts in width. So we've got to work on a low tide basis, because the other side of it, on the high water, the shore arches of the bridges are non-navigable for most vessels. So, but we need to look to plan as to how it can accommodate that and ensure that, infrastructure, moorings are not put in a position that could potentially restrict the growth of such services in the future, because that has happened in years gone by, and we're now paying the price for that.
Do you think, I mean, TfL, Danny's talked about some of the work that's going on, but do you think there's enough grip around getting this comprehensive strategy and action plan that's needed?
Yes, I do. I mean, there was a significant change about 5 or 6 years ago in TfL when TfL recognised the importance, and I think it was on the back of one of these meetings, that put a focus on the river and recognised that the river needed some good, strong management. And we had that, as we've heard, due to cutbacks. We've had a wobble. We've had 18 months of not so strong steer, but Danny has got a very good structured team there now, and equally, the PLA have issued a vision now for the river that encompasses everything, not just passenger. So I'd like to think that everybody now is going to start talking, collaborating, and working towards a sustainable river growth, as I've just articulated.
Emma, you want to come in, and then I've got other members who want to come
Yeah,
in.
just on the passenger side, of course, us commuters, what we need is a reliable, kind of service. And every morning when I'm waiting for the 8:19 boat, I have a conference call at 9 o'clock, with Russia or Iran or anywhere else dodgy. So I need to be able to get there on time. So when all these things are being taken into account, we must remember that. And on the other side, when I'm commuting home for the 6:02 or whatever, if it's a nice sunny day, you suddenly get an influx of people that nobody recognises. Because it's nice and sunny, they want to go on a boat. And often we get pushed out. So if there are a whole load of tourists in front of me or people just looking to take a trip to Putney for the afternoon, I can't get home on that boat after a long day at work. So that needs to be taken into account.
Thank you. Keith, you wanted to come in on this point, and then...
You actually asked the question I was going to ask, Chair, so it's fine.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's
Caroline Russell.
Thank you. I want to have a look at the environmental impacts of the of these river services. Obviously, in terms of carbon emissions, water transport is incredibly efficient. It's got 17% of the carbon emissions of road transport and 50% of the carbon emissions of rail transport. But if we look at the NOx emissions, then I I think there's possibly more of a question there. So could you, I don't know whether, because I think the Port of London Authority has done a draft air quality strategy last December. Would you like to say a bit about the situation with air pollution?
Yeah, no, sure. It's a really important issue. So we published a draft strategy. We're about to launch the final strategy following the consultation. And I mean, just a little bit of sort of facts and figures on it. So one of the things we did was to compare on the freight side a sort of per ton of goods transported on the same journey, whether by river or by HGV, and we modelled that for a number of different journeys. And as you say, on the carbon side, it's a clear winner because obviously you're using tidal energy to transport the goods. On the particulate side, it's also much improved. NOx is the real focus issue for us now, and what the study showed was that at the point at which the emissions are emitted, on like-for-like comparison basis, vessels produce more NOx than the equivalent HGV. However, if you then do the dispersion modelling, which TfL does and which the Department for Transport does, to look at the air quality impacts of those emissions, because the river is wide and the traffic tends to be in the middle of it, by the point you get to the receptors on the land side, it's 5 to 6 times better from a NOx perspective. So I think that's quite an important sort of story in a way, because it's not straightforward to tell, because it's certainly true that a lot of vessels the regulations around engine standards on the vessels are less strict than the equivalent HGVs. However, from an overall air quality point of view, we can safely say that the river is a better mode in all of those pollutants. Having said all that, I mean, we're not saying that means that there's no problem. And at the moment, from a NOx perspective, the river accounts for around 1% of London's total emissions. And if nothing else happens, if sort of no other action is taken, that 1% will increase to 2%, simply because there's obviously a lot tighter regulation around the low emission zones, etc., on the road network, and because of growth in river traffic. So we will become an increasing part of the issue. So what the strategy basically says is that we need to get a grip on this, and the first thing we need to do is actually establish what is technologically possible. As I say, there obviously are a whole set of international, currently European and domestic regulations around vessel engine standards. There is an option to put additional incentives in place to encourage the speedy take-up of those improved, more modern standards. That's one option which we're committed to looking at. The second is things like abatement technology, so particularly SCR, selective catalytic reduction. Is it technically possible to fit that to vessel engines, or do you have to change the engine, which obviously can be prohibitively expensive? So we're committed to doing a detailed study to look at that. And all as I've said to many colleagues in the GLA, what we need to do is to make sure we've got that evidence in place before we decide what's the best package of regulatory and incentive measures. Because at the moment there isn't the evidence to know which would be the most effective solution. So that's what we're committed to doing.
Okay, and what about exposure? Because you say that by the time that the NOx reaches land, it's not as bad as living by a main road. So that's good for the people who are living alongside the river. But for the people who are working on and travelling on the boats, the exposure when the NOx is emitted is higher than the NOx levels on a road. So we know that the exposure of people who are, for instance, inside vehicles on the road is worse than the exposure of people who are outside walking along the street. But have you looked at the health impacts for both the passengers and the people who are working on those boats in terms of the NOx when they're exposed to it on the boat?
We have, and obviously this is a direct issue for us as an employer as well, because it's a health and safety issue for our staff, many of whom work afloat. So we have actually, over the last 4 months, we've been doing a study we've put monitoring points on our vessels, and we've been monitoring the effects of that, which we will get the results at the end of May. The first set of results we had showed that the NOx exposure was lower than on the land again, and the reason simply being because the emissions tend to be behind. So therefore the actual impact on the river we don't think is particularly significant, but we will have the full set of those results in a couple of weeks.
And will they be published in a couple of weeks?
We can certainly share some data. I mean, this was specifically an internal study to look at the impacts on our own staff, but I think there could be some wider lessons for other operators, so we'll certainly be happy to share some data on that.
That's great. Does anyone? Yes.
I'd just also like to add that it doesn't just stop with a simple engine and power solution. We have reduced significantly in our recent build of vessels, and a lot of it is to do with their design and weight. Weight is one of the biggest issues. That requires more power, and there are regulations that are being brought in that don't necessarily lend well to that fact. We obviously want the safest boat possible, but when we've got duplication of certain pieces of equipment that has been designed for an open water transit where you're a long way away from land, and it's just been blanket applied to an inland waterway, it's an area that is becoming very inefficient. And so the lighter that we can make boats and design boats in the future, the less power we're going to need to move them.
So you're saying that the boats are being constructed for travelling on open water, on the sea,
no, the regulation,
to those regulations.
Yeah, I mean,
and
you couldn't take one of our boats and sail it across the channel on a daily basis. But what I'm saying is the regulation, the requirements in the build have to follow the same requirements of those larger vessels. And so we've got to look at everything in the round moving forward to ensure that we are improving the efficiency of our mode.
While staying safe.
Absolutely.
Caroline, you move to your next question. Could
Yes,
I just welcome Bonus Pastor Catholic College from Lewisham, pupils from there. Welcome today. This is the Transport Committee, and today we're looking at river services and looking at how we can increase the number of passengers who are using the river as a way of getting to work or going about London. Back to you, Caroline.
Yes. So my next question is a slight sort of shift in emphasis here, is whether there is any potential for a demand-responsive river taxi service. Now, having heard earlier about the congestion on the piers, I was thinking, well, you know, that probably blows that idea out of the water. But just to investigate it, I gather that the Mayor has had some conversations with a company called Sea Bubbles, who've been talking to Paris. It's some kind of hydrofoil taxi service that would work a bit like Uber, that has a room for a pilot and 4 passengers. It doesn't seem to be happening in Paris, but is there... Yeah, what's your response to this idea?
Just to add, we are discussing, someone has approached us with an idea of a taxi on the river, and it's not the first time I think it's been approached. I think it'd be quite an interesting concept. I'm particularly interested in Sean's response to this. I mean, arguably, we have private hire vessels there. It's not quite on demand, but if you want to hire at relatively reasonable expense, or some would say reasonable value, you can hire small vessels to take you from one place to another. But that does take quite an advanced booking system, and we help support that with those boat operators. But no river taxi as of yet.
Robin.
Well, I was just going to add, I mean, we are also going to look at that and that particular one. I have to say, sometimes we're surprised we get approaches for not just river taxis, but for other sort of river uses, and companies are not always aware of the basics of the River Thames, particularly the tidal flow. And obviously, you can have a taxi which will work brilliantly on a lake or on an impounded river where there's no tide, but it's pretty quick. You have to sort of stand and look over London Bridge to see how fast the tide moves. So you obviously need a lot of power in that environment to be safe. So whether or not this particular proposal is viable, I don't know at the moment, but that's one of the things we need to look at.
And Sean?
I think I'm all for. I think the more the river is used, and the more the river becomes a focal point, the better it's going to be for everybody. But we do need to come back to safety and commercial viability. And as Robin said, it is a very, very fast-flowing river. There isn't a day or week that goes past that we don't get a fouled jet or a fouled prop, just because of the debris that get washed into the river further upriver during heavy rain seasons and things like that. So, them smaller boats are always going to be very much more susceptible to damage and breakdown. And then, from a commercial perspective, I would struggle to see how it would be viable without very excessive fares, purely because of the fact that the regulation requires that you have to have 2 people, even with a vessel of 4 passengers, unless the captain can dock the vessel and let the passengers off without leaving the conning position. Then he needs a second person to assist him with that. So it would require bespoke docks as well, and that is a positive, because what you don't want is a lot of small boats buzzing around piers where there's bigger boats, because that's when incidents could happen. So if it were to happen, it'd be great for them to have smaller dedicated piers and docks that may be able to add to their efficiency as well.
You were trying to address the issue that Emma raised earlier of turning up and finding there wasn't enough capacity on the boat to get home. That probably, if you were starting that from scratch, you would make sure that you provided more of the big boats rather than trying to set up little demand responsive boats.
Absolutely, and then going back to your environmental point, you know, and as Robert touched on, you know, you would need fairly significant power to move 4 people at a speed that is going to be acceptable to the customer.
Yeah, you can watch the bicycles going by.
What's your view as a customer, Emma?
Well, you know, it's the same thing. I need reliability, and I need to get to work on time, and I need speed. So, you know, small boats are fine if they can compete with the Thames Clippers, but right now I'm not sure that that's the case. And, you know, I know how fast that river runs. If you stand on any jetty when the tide is changing and the tide's coming back in, those houseboats and other, you know, kind of other jetties are thrown around massively. So it is a very fast-moving river.
Keith, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, it's a question to Danny really, but it's probably a bit unfair, so you probably won't know the answer, but you're here from TfL today. As we know, the diesel engines on the boats are not Euro 6. So are there plans to make them subject to the ULEZ when it's introduced? Because obviously they'll be within the ULEZ zone. And also, why is it they're not subject to the T-charge as well?
I will satisfy your question by saying I can't answer that one. what I can say is Thames Clippers and TfL are working on a trial, to emission abatement trial, which we're just going through the project discussions, but this will be funded by TfL, and I think at least to see what it is we can do to support what can be done there. I mean, and also to mention, we will be welcoming 2 new Woolwich Ferry vessels towards the end of this calendar year with improved pollution levels, which I'm told actually at 1 o'clock this morning I was told that they float, which is really good news.
Reassuring, I suppose.
Could I just to follow up on that? I mean, we did look at this in our air quality strategy, and it's the regulation is pretty Byzantine, and there's IMO regulation, there's EU inland waterway vessel standards, there are UK level, and they are just basically different from the Euro standards that are applied on the road. And I think one of our messages really in the strategy is to make sure that we explore what is the art of the possible first in terms of abatement of the emissions on these vessels, because if you were simply to sort of apply the same regime as on the road, the ULEZ and the T-charge, the risk is that you drive traffic off the river, and particularly when it comes to freight, that will then go on the roads. And as I've just explained earlier, actually the emissions of carbon particulates and NOx would all be worse. So the perverse consequence of ineffective regulation on the river would be to worsen London's air quality. So therefore, what we think we need to do is to sort of build up the evidence base and then look at what is a river-specific set of incentives and regulation which will work, rather than something which sort of gets translated direct from the road system.
It's a fair point, but no regard is being given to small businesses and people on low incomes when this charge is being levied.
Okay, let's keep focus on the river. Joanne.
It follows on from that about the standards, and something Sean said earlier about boat manufacturers. You can't just go and purchase a new boat with a better engine. Have TfL done any lobbying to manufacturers, as you do to motor vehicles, to try and get them to offer something different?
To be fair to the manufacturers, their hands are tied from a construction perspective. They have to build to a standard. Our vessels are built to the High Speed Craft Code, which is an international code, predominantly designed for international voyages, and has been applied to our operation from an inland waterway perspective. Ironically, we have got exactly the same engine in our boats that is in a coach in a Euro 6 environment. For some reason, it's just graded differently because it's marine. It's exactly the same engine. And we're lobbying those manufacturers, even to the point of we've just placed an order for a new boat, and we was trying to compete, get the suppliers to compete on what they could provide us, not on price, but on quality, air quality. So it's as Robin articulated, the marine industry is slightly internationally is slightly behind the land drivers.
It seems to me that TfL, with lobbying and whatever, if you could get something that could be held up as a best practice example, that might shift. It'd be interesting to say, Danny, whether TfL are prepared to do anything about that.
Yeah. We'll take that back. We've worked quite closely with Thames Clippers about what it is we can do jointly, because we find the resource as it is on the river, there's an expertise which TfL can bring in to help them with that. But we'll take the particular lobbying.
There has just been a significant amount of funding from the EU to a Norwegian-led organisation that we have been asked to be part of and agreed to be part of that, where they are looking at designing the future vessel about, and they've chosen us above any other operator in Europe because of the complexities of the Thames. We heard about the speed of the tide and everything else, the height for bridges, or the lack of height for bridges at high water and the lack of water at low water. So they've chosen us because we are such a difficult box to tick, to ensure that whatever is developed it can be utilised pretty much on any waterway. You know, there's some very good organisations internationally that are involved in that. Wärtsilä is the engine manufacturer that's going to play their part in the technology that will operate this. You know, one of the obviously the battery power is an obvious answer, but currently, as I articulated earlier, weight is an issue. They've got to be buoyant and they've got to be safe. And if you add the batteries that are needed to propel a vessel, then you can't carry any passengers.
I should say we've just been through a European journal process on procuring a pilot cutter. So this is operating outside the London boundary, taking the pilots out to the to service the big ships that come into the port. And we're trying to procure what we think is the world's first hybrid pilot cutter, because they have to operate in quite heavy waters at speed. And actually, it's a commercial process, but the only bid and the successful bid in that process is the British Boatyard, who can build that for us, which is great. So the technology is developing, and I think hybrid in particular, could offer a solution to some of these issues.
I was going to say what TfL will consider, or certainly within the London Pier strategy consider, is what do we do with the pier infrastructure to enable this, and how do we influence operators within licence fees and all those sorts of things to encourage in improved emission.
We have to plan for electric charging points as well.
We've actually only yesterday installed a new pier at our base that is going to provide electric power for the entire fleet overnight. So there will be no generators running. Everything, all the engineers' overnight works will all be carried out, being supported by 100% by electric. So there are a lot of things that we're doing to improve.
Okay, let's move on now to talk about passengers and how we can improve their experience. David.
Right, thank you, Chair. Good morning. Yeah. So I'll first of all direct my question to Emma, because you're a passenger representative. Just in general terms, what do you think would make river bus services better for passengers?
Well, how can I describe to you? So you queue up, get on the boat, you have a lovely seat, you may or may not get a window seat. You're feeling thirsty, you pop in and have a coffee, a tea, a pastry, something hot. You've had a bad day at work, at the end of the day you get back on the boat, you can have a gin and tonic. So I can't really complain about Thames Clippers.
Told the committee you did alcohol. We're going on a site visit. I haven't mentioned
Tom's
so,
tearing up.
yeah, so the experience itself is amazing, and everybody I have spoken to, and I have spoken to a lot of passengers, have, you know, really loved the service. And what they need, as I've already said to you ad nauseum, is reliability and speed to get to work on time. And that's it, really. And they need to be able to get on the boat, obviously. So, yeah.
Sounds to make it sound like the most luxurious.
No, really, I can't. Please, if
method
you
of
all have a
travel,
chance to go on the boat to work one day, please try it.
Fantastic. But what about frequency of the service? I mean, is that an issue as well as reliability?
Well, I mean, again, you know, the Thames is quite long, and you know, people commuting from Putney have to get all the way to Canary Wharf, for example. So it's quite a long journey. So there is a restriction on that side. But I mean, I have an option from my jetty at Cadogan, which is Albert Bridge. I live in Battersea. I cross through the park over the bridge to Cadogan, and basically I have a 756, an 802, I think, an 819, an 856. So, you know, that generally covers us. But of course, we would always like to have more. We're greedy passengers, so to say.
That sounds as though there's more services in the peak times, and then as you get to the end, there's a lower frequency. I understand there's been a new timetable implemented at the end of April. I mean, have there been any issues with that at all that you can think of?
On the passenger side, no, I wouldn't say so. I mean, we did lose a service that ran from Vauxhall at the weekends and up to town and so on, but that's been replaced by Battersea Power Station, which is lovely. So, you know, I use that quite frequently, and others do as well. So that's great to have that opportunity. And obviously people are asking, can we have, you know, kind of services during the week? Well, that's a different question that people will have to look at.
Now, how about the fare structure? I mean, at the moment, I understand it's not that well integrated into the whole TfL structure, and that it doesn't count towards pay as you go. Is that correct? And would you? Is there any way that the fare structure could make travelling by boat, a river bus, more attractive to passengers? Do you think?
Well, myself personally, I use the Thames Clippers app, so I have that on my phone, and then I would just load up on a weekly basis my weekly travel card if I need it, or a single or whatever. Other people do use their cards, so their credit cards, and just direct debit. And I have seen people with Oyster cards that they've loaded up and put money on there, which has been addictive. So as far as I understand, it's open to all. If you pitch up with cash, that's slightly more difficult. You'd have to, say if the boat was there, you'd have to rush and try and buy a ticket in time. You may or may not be able to do that on time.
I don't know, Daniel, have you got any comments about that? Because I mean, at the moment, I don't think it doesn't count towards the pay-as-you-go capping system. That's what I mean. Is that something you're thinking of introducing in the future or not?
I think it's got to be economically viable to do that. Similar to cycle hire and cable car in a way as to how those areas are funded, or indeed if it would need to be an element of subsidy. I do think the connectivity with TfL is really important, and that's a key focus area. I mean, just generally that people see the river as a line, as a transport link, and very much on par with other forms of transport, and that's a key focus that we're looking at the moment. Access to tickets, as you say, for those in the know how to download, and particularly with the river bus service, that works quite well. For a number of visitors to London, there are still challenges. If you were to walk outside Westminster station and you're faced with a row of ticket vending units, it's quite a confusing proposition. And these are some of the key areas of customer experience that we'll be looking at within the London Piers strategy. I think the view is, even if it's not integrated with the wider TfL offering, contactless is obviously a familiar message. But for those other operators, the river tours, it's also ensuring that people know they can purchase tickets in advance through a variety of means, and getting that done before people arrive.
Now, sticking on connectivity and your TfL journey planner, I understand that sometimes river buses don't come up unless the user explicitly asks it to show the river journeys. I mean, so, for example, there might be an option that's quicker from one point to one point, but it doesn't come up in the initial search. I mean, is that something that you're looking at?
It comes as a default for the fastest journey.
Right.
But actually, that is something that we're discussing internally as part of how the river connects. And again, like cycle hire and like cable car in a way, just because they all come sit with my team. But we've got to, I think, in TfL, look at how we communicate those options, and so people can see that river is a viable option. And if it's scrolling down and it's not there on the first page of options of transport from one direction to another, that does make it more challenging. So we are looking at how we promote river internally, and also how we connect key transport hubs, the communication and the wayfinding. And I'm pleased that we've put aside around £100,000 to improve some signage and pain points to help promote wayfinding in some key locations on the river, just to improve the identification of where piers are.
Yeah, if I can, thank you. Yeah, I'll come back to Emma. Your hand's up there.
Yeah, no, just to say that word of mouth is very important as well, and there's been also articles in the Evening Standard about the service. So, and if you see a person in a suit wandering around near the jetty looking a bit confused, people immediately say to them, "Listen, let me tell you about the Thames Clippers and how you can get to work quickly." So, I think word of mouth is massively helpful.
I mean, what do you think about the maps, the TfL journey planner, and the signage at the piers and accessibility as well? And do you think that they're all good, or do you think there is areas for improvement in those things?
It's difficult to say. I suspect as a tourist perhaps I might be a bit confused, but I think when you come onto a jetty there's always people there that can help you and answer questions, and there are maps up, and generally they do show various areas where you might want to visit as a tourist or whatever. On commuters, I think again, if you went to a jetty, there are maps there that show you where you need to go, and then people are not helpless. You can look on where does this jetty end and what's near it, and so on and so forth. So I think people can do their own research.
I suppose when people are used to using it and using it regularly, then it's not a problem because people know what they're doing. But I'm thinking about attracting new people into it, and what could be done to make access easier for people who want to start using it, to encourage people to start using it.
I did notice after the Evening Standard, the last one, was it a year or so ago, article that more people did appear on the piers. So anything like that, I think, helps very much so.
Yeah, some article in the
everyone
thinks,
talking
that's
about
exciting
gins and
then.
tonics
Okay,
and all that good stuff. Yeah,
right. Yeah. Finally, come back to you, Danny. I understand that there's 22 piers and 19 of them are wheelchair accessible. Have you got any plans to make the other 3 wheelchair accessible as well?
All of TfL piers are fully accessible. Some of them are privately owned piers. So there has been an improvement and there has been an increase in accessibility in those piers, but I do think there are 1 or 2 changes that we need to try and help influence from those private pier owners. We don't necessarily have complete ownership and control over those, but there is influence.
Right, okay. So the TfL ones are all wheelchair accessible, but there's got to work with some third parties.
As well as boat operator services as well.
Yeah, okay.
I can give you an example of that. So on my particular pier in Cadogan, at the beginning of the Thames Clippers ramping up their services, they did have a lot of problems with that pier, and that is a privately owned pier. So they were saying, we're not particularly keen on having additional volumes. I don't know how Thames Clippers or TfL got over that, but they did, thank God. But there were issues, so that's something else to bear in mind.
Okay, thanks. Would you other gentlemen have anything to add, or are you happy with the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I do think this point about the search on the app and coming up with river options is really important. And if what needs to happen technically to achieve that, but obviously if it's not on the first screen, then people don't tend to find it, do they? So I think anything that Danny and his team can do to get that really integrated into the app system would be fantastic.
And we've heard if we can create a vision for the future as the Thames as a tube line, I think that would have far more impact than what River Bus as it is currently does.
Just to add, a lot of these subjects are absolute key ingredients to the London Piers strategy, which later this year we would hope would be published by then. So not self-inviting ourselves to return, but I do think it'd be quite a good idea possibly to perhaps return once that strategy is shared, so you can sort of see what progress and what we're focusing on. Our
report from this will be trying to influence some of that. Could a licence condition be linked to the accessibility issue? But actually you don't use those piers if they're not accessible, and you look at not licensing, so that could be a tool.
And are used.
Well, and I think the PLA would play, because they are the custodian of that infrastructure, where that infrastructure sits. So I think, for the future, and there, I mean, London River Services TfL did produce a peer design build document a couple of years ago that is communicated to the developers that are building their own set. So pretty much all of the new piers that are being built to a good standard for accessibility. During the Olympics, we carried a significant amount of people that had accessibility issues, and it was deemed, the river was actually deemed to be very successful in that regard. And if we can just loop out those odd few piers that in the future, because at the end of the day they are requiring refurbishment or replacement anyway, so there is an opportunity there to do that.
Okay, lovely. Keith, you want to come in here?
Yeah, to Danny, really, in relation to the journey planner, I was a big advocate of that until I went out with a couple of guys from TfL who said, we don't use that, we use Citymapper. And Citymapper uses information supplied by TfL, so whatever they do, Journey Planner could do. And I just pumped in a couple of points to get here, just from Greenwich to London Bridge, and it gives me the trains, but also actually does give me, I didn't know this, but does give me the ferry option as well. And in fact, I can even do it by jetpack in 9 minutes, apparently.
Very good.
We'll speak to our innovations team.
We have met some of them. Lovely, thank you. Let's move on to the management and coordination. Florence.
Thank you. Danny, you cited the London Pier strategy, which will be announced later this year. And I'd say one of the issues with the River Service is that the management and coordination is led by different departments, different bodies. So you've got LRS responsible for the licensing, you've got Thames Clippers responsible for the bus, Clippers operating the river bus, PLA responsible for the waters. And in September last year, the Mayor established the Thames London River Waterways Forum. A bit of a tongue twister there. And that forum replaced another Waterways Commissions and Rivers Coordination Forum. How do you feel that forum has improved some of the strategic issues and activities in helping to coordinate all the different services across the river?
We've started, and the reason I say that is because it's not a huge amount of time for something that's quite a strategic group, but we have had some good workshop groups. So as part of the forum, there are 3 main leads, of which passenger service is a key one, which I chair. And actually very recently, we had a very good working session on the peer strategy with a lot of sort of really good innovative ideas in terms of partnership of what we can do with some of the pain points. And interestingly, a number of the things that we've mentioned here about connectivity with TfL have come up. So we have these meetings on a quarterly basis. The actual peer strategy in draft form will be shared with the steering group, next steering group in the summer. and we're hoping very soon after that will be published, but of course it needs to go through the steering group first of all. The London Peer Strategy, if you like, is a strategy. Underneath that, a lot of our time within the peer working group is spent looking at actions and getting thoughts and ideas, and to turn that into a plan of activity. One of the things that's really clear of, in the success of River doubling its volume over the last 10 years has been a real collaborative working group and an energy and a pulse. And we want to keep that pulse going. So it is early days, but I think we've got a tangible strategy which will be published later this year, and actions with a broad spectrum of river stakeholders as well as borough representatives with water frontage involved.
Do you feel that in terms of the PLA being part of that wider group?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we chair the third of the working groups, the people and places, and I mean, I think what I would say is that the leadership from the mayor down is really important in this, and we've been lucky in Val Shawcross, who's been personally really passionate about it and committed to it, and obviously continuing that leadership is really important, because part of, I think, what will make a success of the vision is as well as addressing all the very specific issues we've been talking about, is the sort of the wider picture. So things like the Illuminated Bridges project, making the river exciting and attractive at night or in the winter when the passenger numbers are lower. The cultural strategy, getting the river centre of that, the fact that you can get to World Heritage sites by river, and you can create excitement around that. So I think some of these sort of wider GLA responsibilities are really, really important to bring into the picture, to make that demand happen.
And do you feel that those concerns are being addressed at that forum?
Yeah, I think they are. I think that the value of it is to bring all those issues together in one place. And I think it's not a criticism. I guess it's just obviously with Val moving on, we just need to make sure that momentum is maintained, really.
I think we'll definitely feed that back to the new Deputy Mayor when she starts. Just a final comment on the coordination and management. And again, I'm mindful that you might mention that it's a bit too early to look at how that's progressing. But in terms of the objectives set by that forum, how will they be measured?
They'll be measured of ultimately it's delivering the Thames vision, which the Mayor's Transport Strategy endorses, in terms of improving and increasing river volume. Yes, so sitting behind a number of the policies is bringing the policies to life with clear, and underneath that having some clear actions and direction of what needs to be done to deliver that. So it is very policy driven. It's part of the Mayor's Transport Strategy documents, very much aligned with the other TfL documents that are being produced.
I what you said, but Val has really taken the lead on this in the last 2 years. Before that, we had Richard Tracy, Assembly Member, as an ambassador for the river. Do you think that sort of role needs to be recreated to make sure the river is being constantly considered in TfL? Sean's nodding.
Absolutely. Richard really sort of promoted the need and the opportunities that river transport can provide certain boroughs. Obviously, he very much looked at the West, and he was instrumental in getting that service up and running. And he was absolutely right. The proof is there in the demand that we see. And I would very much welcome a similar sort of ambassador moving forward that is speaking. One of the biggest issues that the previous model, the Concord Act, faced, and yes, we've got, from an operator's perspective, we've got Transport for London, we've got the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and we've got the Port and London Authority, all regulating us in different aspects, and it's not easy, but it's achievable, and they're talking to each other more and more. Those that are not talking to each other are the boroughs, and I see those as the biggest stumbling block. They see the river as this demarcation line, and their next door boundary being the demarcation line, and there is no joint up thinking in that regard. And I'm a bit disappointed in the lack of input for instance, from Tower Hamlets and Southwark in the consultation of the Thames, the river crossing between Rotherhithe and Canary Wharf. The cost of that bridge is so significant compared to what a totally electric cross-river ferry service could deliver without no significant infrastructure. This has got to be a swing bridge to allow ships and large vessels to come up through. And I think there is an opportunity there to start looking at how the river can play a part in connectivity from one shore to the other. And that could be a pilot that will eventually be delivered as it's in the Mayor's plan between the Greenwich Peninsula and Canary Wharf and the North Shore. That could be replicated all the way down the river as developments expand, Barking, Thamesmead, all the way down as the corridor expands from housing, so that the river, and the more of that you get, the less the river will be seen as a boundary.
But the idea of having an ambassador helping to pull all that together, everyone thinks is a good idea. Right, let's move on to TfL's support for river bus services. Tom.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, well, first of all, to Danny, how does TfL invest in river services, both in terms of investment in infrastructure and the operating subsidy?
In infrastructure, of course, the business plan will be investing up to £1 million each year of the business plan in renewal works and maintaining the piers, because I think it's really important. There's a lot of infrastructure out that TfL does and we need to maintain them for high safety levels. We're also investing this year, it's sort of short term I suppose, but looking at what we can do of improving the connectivity, signage, wayfinding, just to try and improve how our customers find the river. So partly linking Westminster or other key station locations so people can actually find the river. So that is some funding that we have already identified and putting in place for this year.
Okay, and do you invest in promoting the river as well? I mean, in terms of, we touched on this with Flo's question, but obviously TfL has, it's one of the most brilliant sort of advertisers in terms of the marketing it produces, great history, even still produces, great marketing, advertising services. I do sort of look, and I don't very often see adverts for river services, and often they tend to be for tourists. Do you invest anything in promoting the river to commuters, for example?
I think a lot of our focus comes as part of the wider digital investment TfL uses, which is to ensure the website is competitive against other potential websites that may want to relay transport information. So there has been an improvement on river in our digital channels in that side. And as I say, I think we've identified there are some improvements that could be made to signage more locally, which we're trying to address now. We do need to look at how we promote river. My view, it's a connectivity part, and certainly we'll be sharing internally with TfL what can we do. Sean Collins on the right hand side would love the river line to be on the tube map, for example. We've got to look at what can be achievable within, to make it connected, how far we can go. I think certainly rivers should be an option. And I think it's less, I suppose, about just finding money to put a marketing promotion, which some would say would happen in the summer at the time when actually most river is very busy anyway. But it's our business as usual connectivity, so it feels part of the wider network, which is where we're focused on at the moment.
The idea of putting on a tube map is really interesting, although of course the challenge there is the tube map is already incredibly congested and is going to get more congested. But because that immediately then puts it into people's minds as something that they could use an alternative to getting on a crowded tube train, for example.
And other options is also about whether there is a possible link, or TfL has a role of actually selling tickets, as it does do with certain visitor attractions. In part with visitor information centres, whether it can use some of its digital channels. So there's a number of these things that are coming out of these work groups that will be taken back within TfL to see what's feasible over the next few months.
In terms of things like, so you have an operating subsidy. I just want to try and understand, when a company like Thames Clippers comes to you and said we want to do this route, Do you also go to them and say, well, we want you to do this route and we will provide you a subsidy to do that? Is it a sort of two-way, is it a two-way thing?
Yeah, and actually subsidy, certainly if you look at the Putney to London Bridge subsidy, came through a tender process, which Thames Clippers bid for and were successful. An overall subsidy for the river has gone down in recent years, with river bus volume going up. So it's shown that has worked particularly well, and our agreement is we will look where we can to phase out subsidy as part of its strategy, working quite closely with Thames Clippers. But I think we need to go through an official procurement process for any sort of level of subsidy, and that comes from a particular contracted service that we run, whereas most of our other services are run on licences.
And how do you promote competition between different companies that want to offer river services?
So we go out to market. I don't know exactly, I wasn't 5 years ago what we did with the Putney service, but we certainly went out to market to try and engage people and other operators wider than just London and people that we know. There's sort of an official process that's always gone through to make sure it's open and fair, and for us competitive, because that's where the value comes from, is making sure that there's competition.
Has any consideration ever been given? Would it be desirable, do you think? Would it be advantageous to TfL, for example, having its own company that offered river services and competed with other companies as well? Or do you think the model where you get other companies to bid is the best way to do it?
On the river, the contracted or the licensing model, actually, because the vast majority of services are licenses, which gives them access to the piers, and it also allows the businesses, to run them and be driven by making sure they're economically viable. It's not a plan that we currently have. We operate and own the Woolwich Ferry, but that's a free ferry service, so it's something that will always need subsidy. So that made sense in that space. But isn't something that we are planning to introduce yet in the Thames.
How are improvements to your infrastructure, particularly the piers, made and funded? How is that done?
So it's within our business plan, within TfL's accounts. It's obviously looking at what the priorities are. Recently, Greenwich Pier Life Extension, we spent £1.3 million on that, which was completed in March. But there's some absolutely fundamental needs of pier and river infrastructure, and we have a business plan that secures that funding to ensure that we've got safe facilities there.
And yes, it's incredibly important. The experience with the London Overground, where once the investment has gone into improving the experience, the train to stations, improving the staffing levels, improving the fact it was on the tube map, and the fact that frequencies were higher as well, of course, all led to huge increases in passenger numbers on there. And what lessons have you learned from other cities around the world? Our briefing talked about Brisbane, where they've got a population of 1/7 of London, but they've got double the number of river bus users annually. What learning have you got from around the world as to how we can improve and grow the passenger numbers?
Certainly a recent visit, I think it was in 2015, where Thames Clippers went out. I think Brisbane was one of those stops. I think it was jointly with Thames Clippers to look at benchmarking services. I think there were some certainly learnings about customer communications. There is let's just say, quite a heavy focus on infrastructure on some of those areas, and the investment is quite significant. I think we've replicated that in some of the pier extensions and some of the, it's quite significant investments that TfL have made since. I do think a challenge for us is to continue to do that and not just looking at other locations, but also tie into which is happening, innovations, other technology innovations and digital innovations, and what impact that has on the river. So that's something that we'll benefit from as a sort of part of the pan TfL.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Brisbane study tour was before I started. But as I understand it, one of the key, I think the chief harbour master of the PLA went to Brisbane. But one of the lessons learned, I think, was the building in at the early stages of planning. So it goes back to Sean's point about the riparian boroughs, and you know, how far is it really central stage? If we're looking at Barking, Riverside, or Erith, or Purfleet, or all of the development to the east, which is going to be so significant. And if you talk to the director of planning or the chair of the planning committee, you know, where on the list of priorities is the river? And I suspect in most cases it's still pretty low, if there at all. So that's one of our efforts. We've increased our planning resource in the PLA in the last year or so, just to be able to be a bit more proactive and get out and talk to the boroughs and say, look, you know, you've got a lot of housing growth, not just about piers, what about water sports, using the river for recreation, creating communities around the river. So I think that's really important, and that as I understand it, was one of the things Brisbane has been really good at, is that it's really sort of central in their policies and planning systems.
Absolutely. Yeah, the developments around Thames Mead, things like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is that something where, is that actually something where we need more in the London plan, perhaps, and more policy and more guidance on that to move that up the agenda in terms of what the boroughs are thinking in terms of planning?
I think the London plan says the right things. I think it's the sort of the amount of political attention, perhaps, to
where it is
to
in
get
that
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
Exactly. It says the right thing, but is it going to be acted upon? And that's my concern. For instance, the Royal Wharf at Silvertown, the developer there is committed to put in a significant pier in. It's going to be a really good connectivity to other modal hubs as well. But there was no consideration initially given by the planning and the transport advisors as to delivering people by bus locally to the pier head. And you know, they would have to have walked. So thankfully, it was at the last phase of the development, and we've managed to get a bus route that's going to drop off within less than 100 metres from the pier, which was deemed to be a success. But equally, you know, in the future, you take the Brisbane model. You know, the bus is literally dropping off, and all over Australia and the US. The buses drop off right at the pier head, so people just have a seamless interchange in connectivity, and obviously heavily support local communities.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, our last area of questions is about expanding services to the east. Joanne.
Yeah, if I look at your map of scheduled services, everything stops at Woolwich. And obviously a lot of the housing development, business development from London is going to be beyond that, to Barking, Riverside and the Thames Gateway. So I'd like to ask a general question first, but then come into some specific if I can. Can you just say, what are the benefits and challenges of doing that expansion further to the east? Sean, do you want to start?
We've got to look at the heart first, and we've got to make sure that the pool of London, the centre of London, has got the ability to cope with those vessels coming in. So there needs to be support in infrastructure in piers and access to those piers. So assuming that is delivered, we have already embarked on a programme with quite a few developers. As I said, you know, Ballymore Oxley have delivered this pier at their cost. So we're really working commercially with others to deliver the piers outside of London and services that is not necessarily drawing on the public purse. We have demonstrated previously that, you know, yes, there is often the need for subsidy, but it is seed corn funding in that majority of our routes now don't require a subsidy. They have become viable and been able to stand on their own 2 feet. And I think moving forward, a similar sort of programme needs to be put in place to support the expansion of river services out to the east, where, you know, there is a strong business case that demonstrates that over time these services can stand alone without subsidy and deliver a high level of service to the customer.
I mean, obviously, you said there that it depends on that central London route being sorted out. But would there be a case for a shorter service from the east outside London just down to Canary Wharf, or would that not be viable?
Yes, I see that has a lot of potential. We recently done a trial last year whilst we was new boats had been delivered, and we was waiting for the completion at Battersea Pier. So we took that opportunity to do some market research on one of the biggest questions we're always asked: what about a service from Gravesend or the outer estuary? And it was very successful, and we got a lot of feedback from that trial. There's nothing like actually doing it, and the indication was that there was a significant amount of commuters that would use that service, and equally we wouldn't want to be stopping at too many piers because it would make it a long journey. So we done that trial. We came into London at Tower Pier, we came into Blackfriars and Embankment, and that was very successful. So I don't see it being a requirement for every pier to be expanded, for every pier to have a stop for every route, and equally as the existing routes develop and expand, not all of those stops need to be included. So we've got to look, and we have done a lot of work on developing a network for the future, so that the river bus services in their own right have got the ability to integrate with each other, to provide accessibility to, because you're quite right, the journey time from say Gravesend or Erith into Canary Wharf is very, very competitive, even not quicker than other forms of transport.
Yeah. So I suppose the ideal would be to have a full length service, but capacity in the centre might mean. But I suppose it's very hard to then decamp passengers from one boat to another. Not very more difficult from bus or tube.
Exactly, and some of the piers are being developed in a way that they really are quite an inviting structure in their own right. So I believe that there's in the design for Royal Wharf, for instance, there's going to be a small kiosk on the pier, so you can get a coffee while you're waiting for the boat, which is just brilliant. That is the sort of thing that is going to really sort of complete the circle in a proper waterborne transport offer.
I was aware of your 4-day trial out to Gravesend. Are you planning on publishing the results, or could you give us an indication of your results perhaps after this meeting? That'd be very helpful.
I'm happy to.
Can I come to Danny and then Robin then about what is needed to actually try and get these piers further out into the east, into the Thames Gateway?
I think first of all, as Sean mentioned, the developer, ensuring we've got an engaged developer is really important. And I see certainly from TfL's perspective, the likelihood of us perhaps building piers going east is very small, but working very closely with the developers and with river bus services to enable that to happen is important, and that includes the connectivity of where a bus might drop people off. That whole package of things of offer that we need to support on, including how the standard of which piers are built to, accessibility and those things. In terms of whether there's a business case for a subsidised service, I think it's going to come down to what the business case says and the value for that. And very keen to see also the results of the Gravesend trial personally. So Sean said he's going to share that with us. But our role is really to engage and enable those connections to happen and then promote those services.
Obviously, when there's any development, particularly significant developments going ahead, TfL is an automatic stakeholder for any planning authority. But are your responders in TfL to those planning, I suppose your stakeholder engagement, are they very clear that they need to put river services on an equal footing with bus and tube and train or whatever at that very early stage?
Absolutely. Very clear in the Mayor's Transport Strategy that river has a key part to play. And I think what the Mayor's Transport Strategy does do is it make it really clear as to where that connects with other policies that we have. So everyone's very focused on that, yes.
So Robin, welcome to you.
Yeah, I mean, we'd be particularly keen on a Gravesend service because the PLA headquarters is in Gravesend, so that would be a door-to-door service, for sure. But no, I think just two further points. I mean, one would really just to reinforce this issue about central London, and obviously, if we don't sort out central London, then we won't have the capacity to develop to the east. And the one single place which I think we need to urgently act is embankment. So if we don't find a solution to that, then we've got a real constraint issue. So that's really important. The broader point I think for me would be engaging with the developers, and sometimes it's about a sort of education as well as information, in the sense that some developers are very familiar with the river and its potential, and others are less so. And we've been talking, for example, to Peabody about the Thamesmead next phase. And just to sort of think through with them, not just what the river bus could do for their residents, their tenants, but also, as I said earlier, the potential of the river for a water sports centre, adding to the quality of life. Because at the moment, I mean, unfortunately, that the first phase of that development, kind of looks away from the river to some extent, which is a missed opportunity, in the sense that you've got this wonderful resource. Of a global river on your doorstep, and you're not making use of it. So I think part of our messaging is around that, and I guess we can do our bit on that. We're a fairly small organisation. Sean obviously does his own engagement with developers, but if there's anything more that the Assembly, the GLA, the Mayor's Office can do to engage at that high level, to say, look, really think through the river opportunities at an early stage, I think would be really helpful.
Would the Waterways Forum be a body that could look at that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I think coming back to the point of a river ambassador, certainly looking at the future for the East is very, very important that we try and get a local business or beneficiary of that pier to provide the funding to get it installed in another location. This was achieved. The Radisson Hotel Group agreed to pay for the installation of the old Blackfriars Pier at East India. This would have given journey times for customers from Woolwich, for instance. Currently it takes them 20 minutes because they have to go all the way around the Isle of Dogs to what we call Canary Wharf West. They would have been there in 10 minutes. And we have hit objection after objection after objection for putting that pier in. And there is no real reason for it other than the development is completed and we don't want it on our doorstep. And it's very, very short-sighted in that instance that we're trying to get something in once the development is completed. So I strongly urge that the plan ensures that there is a clear scope for a pier to be put in those areas and on those sites that are identified to be...
Okay. Yeah. My final question then, this has been, I think, come up in quite a number of recent articles, is the obvious stop missing is City Airport. Is that something that's been looked at all?
Well, the Royal Wharf Pier is going to be quite close to that. I mean, City Airport is whilst it's perceived to be on the river, it's actually set back quite away from the river. It is, yeah. And it's got a massive industrial wharf between it and the river, being Taylor Isle. So, it's not without its challenges. We think that having the bus stop now quite close to the pier at Royal Wharf is going to potentially give us an opportunity to connect up there. to the airport, and we especially given its expansion as well, and we see that as an opportunity to maybe run a shuttle service to Royal Wharf, so that passengers can access, because you're quite right, you look at the journey time from there to the Greenwich Peninsula and from there to Greenwich, Surrey Quays, Southwark, it'd be quicker by river than any other form of transport.
Just to add, I think we look at all options, I suppose, as to where demand is there. I mean, the DLR does from the City Airport take you to London Bridge within 20 minutes. And that's actually something that people don't always aware when they arrive, because people tend to take private taxis, and there's a lot of work I know the DLR team have done to put a lot of focus on moving people by rail. But certainly I haven't seen a huge demand. I was told that in the 1980s there was a service that did run, but obviously that was quite a long time ago.
And pre-DLR.
And pre-DLR, of course.
Pretty much everything, actually.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, we've come to the end of our questions. Were there any points, and particularly Emma, because obviously some of it we've been getting into some technicalities, were there any other points any of our panel want to raise? No? We covered everything? That's fine. Well, can I thank you very much, Emma, Sean, Danny and Robin, for your contributions today. It's been really useful discussion, lots of ideas coming out from it, and we will be shortly, we're just arranging to do a trip on the Thames Clippers, but I was planning morning to have tea and coffee. I think I'm now going to be under pressure to go at a different time. They wanted to come out and have a look. I think it's going to be a little bit of pressure there, but come out to chat with you whilst on the river, having a look at the services and the boats. So some of them are members who maybe don't use the boats or haven't for a while. So thank you very much for your contribution. Members, can we note the report as background to the questions and the discussion we've had? Noted. Lovely, thank you very much. And we did all the other business, so I just need to...
Sorry, there was the additional...
I did that earlier, I thought. Okay, I think I said it earlier, but just to confirm that you're going to agree to delegate to me in consultation with group leads to agree any outputs from today's meeting and the site visit. I thought I'd done that earlier, but just in case. Our next meeting is 13th of June at 10 in the morning. I have no other business. Thank you, members, very much.